Hello, bros. We're back with Funeral Customs, Their Origin and Development by Bertrand S. Puckle. It is a 1926 book that was re released in 1968. We're on chapter 6. We've moved past the bells, even though I have the bells out. Feasts and processions. I need to put a book under this. So, totally destroy the spine. Wailing women were in the procession, giving vent to professional emotion, as a foil to the studied calm of the mourners, whilst the mimes followed after, wearing the ancestral marks described elsewhere. The relatives were placed in strict order of precedence, the heir walking immediately behind the buyer. Let me check that out. I want to see if that's how you say it. I don't think that's right. I think it's beer. We'll see, though. Buyer. Funeral buyer. Let's see how it's pronounced. I'm only halfway through the book. Might as well see how it's pronounced. Come on. Buyer. Burr. Is it Burr?
Beer.
Beer. It's not buyer, it's beer.
Beer.
Alright, so that's beer, not buyer. Alright, that's good to know. The relatives were placed in strict order of precedence, the heir walking immediately behind the beer, his hair disheveled, the folds of the dark gray or black toga, which he wore, held before his face in the approved manner of the old tragedian who learnt the trick from him. For the rest, there were the musicians, torchbearers, and lictors. At some public place, the procession would halt for the funeral oration, which was considered as a most important part of the proceedings, and from thence it wended its way outside the city walls to the pyre. The special prominence given to the servants of the household is a relic of the days when they were slaughtered at the graveside. In China, they walk in front of the body and are sacrificed in figure by the burning of paper effigies. The wax masks used by the Romans remind us of the curious wax figures which are familiar to those who have visited Westminster Abbey, where the ragged regiment, as it is called, forms a feature of much interest to sightseers. These now dilapidated portrait models represented at their funerals Queen Elizabeth, Charles II, William III, and Mary, Queen Anne, John Sheffield, the Duke of Buckingham, the Duchess of Richmond, William Pitt, the Earl of Chatham, and Lord Nelson. They were either placed on the coffin or carried in the procession, a custom which was introduced towards the end of the 14th century in the case of royal or noble persons. The figures were left after the burial to mark the place of interment, till such time as a monument could be erected over the vault. In the Chinese funeral procession, a banner is borne before the body inscribed with the name and titles of the deceased, whilst the insignia and arms of those of position are carried on a cushion, a practice common in all countries. In England, in the Middle Ages, the horse and armor of the knight preceded the corpse, the horse afterwards being claimed as a mortuary, due to the church where the funeral mass was celebrated. The armor was either given to the next of kin or placed over the tomb, as in the case of Edward, the Black Prince, whose surcoat, shield, and helmet, which were carried in the funeral procession, according to the instructions in his will, repose in his tomb in Canterbury Cathedral. The sword, helmet, and baton, in the case of a field marshal, are today placed on the coffin of the warrior, whilst his orders and medals are carried, as a rule, on a cushion in the procession. Even in modern Italy, we still find traces of medieval processions, such as the Lady Dorothy Neville describes as having seen in Verona, which recalls something of the old Roman pageantry. Passing through the streets one day, she met the coffin of a poor man's child being carried to the church. It was attended by a number of little boys bearing torches, a remnant of the days when burials took place at night and retained, as we have seen, by reason of the flickering torch, being an accepted symbol of the uncertainties of life. Following this humble procession was the funeral of a child of wealthy parents, the deep notes of the bassoon accompanying the singing of a hymn. The body was followed by a long train of white-robed priests and their assistants, and the usual complement of torchbearers and mourners. By the side of the bier, 4 little boys were walking, wearing helmets decked with gaudy plumes, and each had a pair of immense wings flapping at his back. In this we see the old ideal expressed of the angels taking charge of the little soul to conduct it into the spirit world, as the ancestors, represented by the masked mimes, were supposed to materialize for the same purpose. The coffin was covered by a rich pall of green and gold, and upon it were wreaths of artificial flowers. Originally, the pall was the pallium or cloak with which the corpse was covered on its way to burial. When the use of coffins became general, the pall ceased to be necessary for the original purpose, and it was then used for draping the coffin. This was probably an excuse to retain the services of the pallbearer, for pallbearing had come to be looked upon as a duty of honor and a mark of rank and esteem. In earlier times, the pall and sometimes the bier was carried by those of the same rank as the deceased, as at Wellington's funeral, when the pall was borne by officers who had shared the hardships of many campaigns by his side. In the case of a man who was of no particular estate, if married, the bearers would be his married friends, or, if single, his bachelor friends performed the task, nor was the matter always left to any chance arrangement, for a dying person frequently decided who should officiate at his funeral, who should carry his bier, pall, and torches. In the case of royalty, the pall is generally supported by princes or the nobility. In Scotland, the pall was called a mort cloth, and in the year 1598, it was decreed at the Kirk Session of Glasgow that a black cloth was to be laid on the corpse of the poor. A custom continued for 200 years after the mort cloth being taken to the house where the body awaited burial and laid over it. The General Assembly of Scotland decreed in the year 1563 that a bier should be made in every country parish to carry the dead corpse of the poor to the burial place, and that those of the villages or houses next adjacent to the house where the dead corpse lieth, or a certain number out of every house, shall convey the dead corpse to the burial place and bury it 6 feet under the earth. In country funerals, it is customary for the tenants or servants to undertake the office of bearers as a mark of special esteem. The bier or bear was originally a very simple affair of the nature of a stretcher on which the uncoffined body was carried to the grave. At a later period, it bore the coffin also. Today, the bear is seldom used, something much more ornate being considered necessary to the dignity of the proceedings. The origin of a word is often helpful in tracing the origin of a custom. So we shall find that hearse is a French word signifying a harrow. The form of the French harrow was triangular, an iron framework to which the spikes were attached. The hearse of the 15th century was a simple iron stand on the lines of the French harrow, with the spikes or prickets adapted as candle holders. The original candlestick was a spiked stick on which the candle was impaled. A contrivance of this sort was used partly as a means of obtaining a considerable light and partly for ceremonial purposes, particularly at funerals. In course of time, the funeral hearse became a very magnificent affair, and a great deal of fine craftsmanship was expended on its construction. It was sometimes made of brass, and a blaze of wax candles flickered on the prickets. From each extremity of the triangle, supports were raised, meeting at the top, thus forming a framework over which black cloth was draped. Fringes and various ornaments were added, and often wax images and garlands served as further decoration, whilst verses and glowing epitaphs were pinned to the material by the mourners. Starkey Gardner describes the hearse light at Osnabrück as a structure 7 feet high. Its massive tripod foot and molded stem supports two spandrel-shaped brackets fitted with tracery. On two sides of the triangle is a step-like arrangement of scrolls and spikes for 15 candles, and on the foot are rings by which it can be moved. The hearse light was planned to carry very large quantities of tapers to enhance the grandeur of great religious ceremonials, when the number of lights were so vast as to be compared with the stars descended from the firmament. Eventually, the funeral hearse was made in such a form as to permit of the coffin being placed on the summit. In the case of the burial of a person of quality, it is also carried the arms or hatchment of the old deceased. Jesus Christ. In the case of the burial of a person of quality, it is also carried the arms or hatchment of the deceased. The whole structure was surrounded by a rail. After interment, the hearse remained for a considerable time. In the choir of the church, votive candles were burned in memory of the church. Were Votive candles being burned in memory of the dead, and it became in this form a cenotaph or a memorial to one buried elsewhere. The modern catafalque, I hope that's how it's spelled, catafalque, on which the coffin reposes during the service in the church, was originally a temporary erection over the tomb, and was not intended to take the place of the hearse proper as it does now. In Roman Catholic churches today, a metal framework is commonly found, often of a triangular form, on which votive candles are lighted, and this is a remnant of the earlier structure described. It is still called a hearse. As has been stated, the hearse was by no means a funeral property only. The term was originally used to describe any kind of barbed grill or protection, such, for instance, as the portcullis, a strong framing of timber resembling a harrow, which was suspended above the gateway of the medieval castle, to bar the entrance in case of a surprise attack. Oh my gosh. In this sense, the word here is still used in heraldry. As the screen of highly ornamental ironwork was a formidable row of spikes or prickets, it surmounted the tombs of the great in the Middle Ages, and on the anniversary of the death would be ablaze with candles. One of the finest examples is the Eleanor Grill or hearse in Westminster Abbey, which was made in the year 1294. Cases are on record of these hearses being removed from the tomb over which they were originally erected and resold at a considerable profit to furnish later requirements. A pall or hanging of rich tapestry was used to deck the tomb on anniversary and feast days, of which the altar frontal, commonly used at festivals in Protestant and Catholic churches, is a survival, for it should be remembered that Mass was originally said at the tomb, which thus became the altar. Dr. Gasquet quotes the following from the will of Thomas Wood of Hull, draper, sheriff, and mayor, who bequeathed to Trinity Church at his death one of my best beds of arras work, upon condition that after my decease I will that the said bed shall yearly cover my grave at my dirge and mass. When the public health became a matter of serious inquiry, and new burial grounds were laid out at some distance from the more thickly populated districts, the old method of carrying the body chested or otherwise on a hand bier became much more difficult, and some sort of horse-drawn vehicle was found to be necessary. In country places, a farm wagon was used for the purpose, draped in some simple manner in order to add dignity to the procession. In the rural villages of Brittany, a pretty custom once prevailed. The body was carried to the grave on a wagon used in the ordinary way to carry corn or farm produce. Tied to the uprights supporting the sides of the vehicle, branches cut from the willow tree, symbolizing resurrection, were bent into arches over the body, thus making a framework, across which a white sheet was placed, forming a canopy. The wagon was drawn by a team of oxen, and the priest followed the cortege on horseback. In like manner, the body of the poet, craftsman, William Morris was carried from Kelmscott one autumn day in 1896 to burial. The farm wagon, which bore the unpolished coffin, resplendent with red wheels and yellow body, was drawn by a sleek roan mare, led by a Kelmscott carter, wreathed by vines and strewn with the traditional willow boughs. This hearse must have been a shock to many narrow minds and the despair of the local undertaker. In the good old days, when the roads, where roads existed, were so bad as to be almost impassable for the greater part of the year, four, or more generally 6 horses, were found necessary to draw the wagon on which the body would be placed, in conveying it to more or less remote places for interment. As, for instance, when a country gentleman called on business or for reason of state to the capital may have died there, his relatives insisting, as was customary in such circumstances, that his body should be removed for burial to the ancestral vault in his own parish. Collier, describing traveling in England in the time of the Stuarts, says the roads were so bad that traveling was very difficult. In bad weather, there was generally only a slight ridge in the center of the road between 2 channels of deep mud. Instead of sloping gradually, the roads went right up and down the hills. Rich men traveled in their own coaches, but they were obliged to have 6 horses to pull them through the mud. Conditions were so bad that the experience described by the poet Gay was by no means uncommon. In the wide gulf, the shattered coach, o'erthrown, sinks with the snorting steeds. The reins are broke, and from the crackling axle flies the spoke. In the 17th century, when the king went to Parliament, faggots were thrown into the ruts in the streets, so that it was possible for the state coach to drive over the uneven surface. And if you don't know what faggots are, they were bundles of sticks. Evelyn gives an account of such a journey. I caused her corpse to be embalmed, wrapped in lead, and a brass plate soldered on, with an inscription and other circumstances due to her worth. The body was thus taken to Cornwall. She was accordingly carried to Godolphin in Cornwall in a hearse with 6 horses, attended by 2 coaches of as many with about 30 of her relations and servants. The corpse was ordered to be taken out of the hearse every night and decently placed in the house, with tapers about it, and her servants attending to Cornwall. We are hardly surprised to learn that the funeral of this lady cost not much less than £1,000. Evelyn also tells us that he went to Mr. Colley's funeral, where the corpse lay at Wallingford House, and was thence conveyed to Westminster Abbey in a hearse with 6 horses, and all funeral decency, near 100 coaches of noblemen and persons of quality following, etc. The roads of Sussex were notoriously bad, and in winter often impassable. It was no uncommon thing for provision to be made in a will by a clause that the body was to be buried at a certain place, if the state of the roads permitted, otherwise at a more convenient place, the selection of which would be left to the discretion of the executors. Costly as the conveyance of the dead by road must have been in the old days, the funeral procession was allowed certain privileges which the ordinary travelers could not claim. The toll, for instance, frequently demanded on the road, was not allowed to be imposed on the mourners, and on a long journey this was a concession of some importance. On the other hand, the clerk and sexton of a parish through which the cortege passed were wont to demand a fee, which they would otherwise have earned, had the corpse been buried there, instead of passing on to some more distant burial ground. This imposition, it may be added, was wholly illegal, though no doubt in an age when the majority of people were quite illiterate, they would easily be frightened into paying a demand, apparently backed by the authority of the church, for the clerk was a comparatively important person. In Scotland, he was even allowed to conduct the burial service. Yet another illegal practice was arresting the corpse of a debtor and withholding it from proper burial till the debt was satisfied. Some extraordinary notions exist today in parts of Yorkshire concerning the legal rights of mourners in carrying a body to burial, and it is still believed that no trespass is committed in passing through a private estate, if in so doing they are taking the coffin by the most direct route to the burial place appointed. Very possibly such a practice existed long enough to constitute a right, as a relic of the days when the roads were impassable. The practice must have presented serious difficulties to the landowner, for it was also the belief that if once a funeral procession was allowed to make use of a private road, it was forever after open for the general use of the public. Hallett, writing on the matter, tells us that it was customary for the undertakers to stick pins in each gate as the corpse was carried through, as payment of a toll to the landowner, thus preserving his rights. As it has already been stated, the ancient Roman law allowed no one who might purchase land to exclude from its access to such burial places as it might contain. In the Hebrides, the peasants prevented by force any attempts to close the shortcuts from the burial grounds to the sea, which the dead were supposed to use when they went to bathe. In Brittany, in the old days, rough tracks were made from the outlying farms to the villages so that the people might go on Sunday to the church or to visit their dead in the graveyard. In the course of time, proper roads were constructed, and the old tracks were only used for funeral processions. It was indeed considered sacrilege to conduct the dead by any other way than that by which their ancestors had gone before them. Unhappy the landlord who attempted to prevent a funeral passing by the sacred route. Many other curious beliefs have existed at one time or another affecting the conveyance of the body to the grave. It was considered a very dangerous thing to take the corpse twice across a bridge from the house where the death had taken place to the church and back again to the burial place, for instance. If this rule should be transgressed, it was thought that the bridge would break. So, in order to avoid such a catastrophe, chapels were frequently built on the bridge itself. The origin of this superstition is not very clear, though the crossing of water has been held as a prevention against the return of the wandering spirit. One is also reminded of the fact that when troops are crossing a bridge, the order is given to break step to obviate a supposed danger to the structure, caused by the rhythm of their tread. The band ceases to play to discourage a unison of movement. So also is the case of the funeral procession, often followed by a multitude of people. Custom forbade singing or the playing of musical instruments while on the bridge. Bumping the coffin is another remarkable practice, considered to be necessary at the pedestal of every wayside cross passed on the journey, and also on the walls of the church when the corpse was removed after the funeral service. This ceremony was performed by the bearers, anticipating the desire of the departed to bid a farewell in this inarticulate manner, and also to serve as a reminder to St. Peter to open the gates of heaven in order to receive the soul of the deceased. In Ireland, should the cortege pass a church on its way to the cemetery, it was thought necessary for the socred, socred to proceed 3 times round the building with their burden before continuing its way to the grave. Traditional usages are worth conserving only in so far as they are beautiful from an artistic standpoint, or of value as symbols of some greater truth to which we subscribe. Consideration of these old customs will enable us to see in our modern funeral procession only a number of dilapidated survivals, and much that is reminiscent of the traveling circus. The modern hearse retains in a meaningless and degraded form certain features of the earlier shrine for burning votive candles, for it was little else in its original purpose. The roof still exhibits something of the canopy form. Fringes and trimmings are much in evidence, whilst the cresting of cast iron spikes or prickets on the roof and a rail running on either side of the coffin are quite unmistakable in their origin. The elaborate funeral car which bore the body of the Duke of Wellington to St. Paul's is a good example of the transitional stage between the hearse, erected in the church, and the sort of traveling shop window to display the handiwork of the undertaker, which we meet in the streets today. The addition of glass sides, often embossed with crude floral patterns, the passion flower predominating, in the manner of the public house door, is a further modern vulgarity. According to what you are prepared, according to what you are prepared, or can be induced to spend, so you will get more or less of the dismal trader's sable horrors, plumes, palls, pinkings, and furnishings, with anything from 2 to 6 of his flat flanked Belgium apologies for horseflesh, whose crimpy manes and swaying tails are so dear to his ghoul like heart. The origin of the over-horsed vehicle we have traced to a necessity when traveling was difficult, having become an excuse for mere stupid display. That's rough. With many painful memories of traffic held up for a funeral procession crawling along a crowded street at a ceremonial pace, we are reminded that the traditional rate of progress is dictated by the one time invariable practice of heading the procession by a cross bearer. The pace was thus restricted by his stride and that of the bearers who carried the bier. On the other hand, it is rather a vigorous swing of the pendulum to hear of a motor hearse traveling at the rate of 33 miles an hour, for which offense a Glasgow undertaker was fined the sum of £3. For the defense, it was urged that being delayed in Glasgow, he feared that the cemetery would not be reached before the gates were closed. Of course, the motor hearse was bound to come. It is now more frequently to be seen, but is mostly used for long distance journeys. Too deep rooted is the love of the old Sharon Karen of the road, Karan Karen, however you say it, for his nightmare paraphernalia to readily adjust his mind to anything so obvious and decent. The first motor hearse the writer met with some 20 years ago was symbolically enough, standing outside a public house in a northern country town. There, sure enough, as might be expected, was modern mechanism tricked up with the traditional emblems dragged forward in a debased form into yet another century. Let it be said here and now that justice may be done, that conveyances, some more or less and others entirely freed from the shackles of convention, are occasionally to be met with in the streets today. Well designed on a consideration of first principles of fitness and utility, there is an increasing demand for the motor carriage as a conveyance for the dead. That it is profitable to the live undertaker goes without saying. The stuffy funeral coach in whose grief-laden atmosphere we are still invited to ride dates back with little alteration in design to the days when the family coach was requisitioned for the purpose. I am reading a book called Funeral Customs, about customs of funeral. The stuffy funeral coach in whose grief-laden atmosphere we are still invited to ride dates back with little alteration in design to the days when the family coach was requisitioned for the purpose. In the days of the Stuarts, black coaches were used not only on the occasion of the funeral, but for a year or more after death. It was considered impossible to travel in any other vehicle. Originally published in 1926. This copy is a reprint from 68. Many of our customs of court mourning dated from this period, when even riding saddles were covered with black cloth. The conservative mind still continues the practice of clothing liveried servants in mourning and placing black rosettes on the horses' bridles. To send a coach for the funeral procession was a recognized mark of respect in the days when there was nothing between the stagecoach and the private conveyance. Thus it became a test as to the number and quality of your friends. If the cortege contained few or many such vehicles, the hired mourner's coach, so prominent a feature in the undertaker's outfit, is still considered in some orders of society as indicative of the social position of the bereaved family, whilst in country places the doctor's carriage, with or without the doctor, is lent by custom in order to swell the procession. Describing the burial of his daughter, Evelyn, that sturdy old champion of the funeral decencies writes, she was interred in the vault east end of the church at Deptford. Divers, noble persons, divers, is that supposed to be diverse? Divers, noble persons honored her funeral in person, others sending their coaches, of which there were 6 or 7 with 6 horses. The velvet trappings of the funeral horse are similar to, and doubtless derived from, the equipment of the pageant horse in the days of chivalry. The saddle cloth bears the crest or monogram of a personage of importance, as that of the officer's charger is embroidered with the regimental crest. Even horse cloths and carriage rugs are decorated in this manner. The subject of the hearse must not be left without some mention of the funeral plumes. In those districts where this luxury can least be afforded, and where its appearance is, if only for this reason, the more incongruous, the sable plumes of death are sometimes seen. The roof of the hearse is covered with a forest of these forbidding ornaments, and a sort of sweep's brush nods from the horses' heads. White in the case of the burial of a child. Thus do the uniformed love to do honor to their dead. As a symbol of a state, the use of plumes is a very old one, whether carried in the helm of the knight or on the dainty head of the debutante. Its use at obsequies is intended to denote the rank and social position of the deceased. On the plea that the use of plumes on horses' heads caused unnecessary suffering to the animals, the British Undertakers Association urged the trade to discontinue the practice as from January 1st, 1914. This decision was arrived at after protracted inquiries, surely a hopeful sign of salvation coming from within. We earnestly recommend that further protracted inquiries into other funeral customs should be made by the same august body assembled. Yet another matter we may note before leaving the funeral procession is the ceremonial staff or baton used by the Roman master of ceremonies and still carried by the undertaker. It is in the nature of the field marshal's baton. It is in the nature of the field marshal's baton, which was originally a box in which his authority was sealed. Wands are sometimes carried as borne in royal processions by the dignitary known as White Wand, who still breaks his symbol of office over the grave of the departed sovereign to signify that his duty of attendance on his royal master is ended by death. And here's the dismal trade and counsel from an old print sign of the now extinct Company of Undertakers. To me, it looks like they're eating chicken, but I don't think that's what's going on. An early form of the modern hearse. And that's the end of chapter 6 and the end of this reading. See how long chapter 7 is. Forward contents. 7 is only 10 pages long. That's great. That'll be a quick read. All right, perhaps that's all. Goodbye. I'll give you some bell. More cowbell, guys.